Welcome to the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. I am your host. My name is Arthur Breur. I am a composer and I am a melody fan. And I am here today with a quite amazing composer named Richard Peat. Richard Peat studied with Sir Peter Maxwell Davies, Nico Mulley, Rian Samuel, and Paul Max Edlin, completing his composition doctorate in 2007. His music has been broadcast on BBC Radio 3 and performed by leading artists, including the London Sinfonietta, the Kreutzer Quartet, Onyx Brass, Icebreaker, Martin Brabants, Nicholas Cleobury, Michael Bawtry, and Stephen Layton. The choir of Selwyn College, Cambridge, and Ely Cathedral Girls Choir, conducted by Sarah MacDonald, have recorded a full-length CD of Peat's choral music for release in 2022. His music is published by Encore Publications. Welcome to the Melodology Podcast.
Really nice to be here. Great to see you, Arthur.
Tell us about your early memories of music and melody.
In the very early 80s, there was an animation by a British kind of cartoonist called Raymond Briggs. So this was like a half-hour animation. There was no dialogue. It was just music. So in a way, it was like an animated ballet. And it's got this great score by a guy called Howard Blake. And I think I was at primary school, so that would be a kindergarten sort of age. And I remember being kind of blown away. And, you know, it's the melodies in that piece are really, really strong. But I do remember, because it's quite tragic as well. You know, the snowman melts and, you know, it was quite kind of traumatizing for a 3 or 4 year old. But there's this amazing bit at the end where there's this little motif in the violins, which kind of represents the sun. And I remember that and it's kind of worked its way into my own stuff. So I think that's probably the earliest thing I can remember. And it's kind of that motif kind of just turns, it's like a kind of Phrygian flattened second thing where there's a kind of like a lean on the flattened second resolving onto the tonic. And I remember that kind of, it stuck in my head for 40 years. It really was effectively a ballet and kind of the total lack of dialogue. So it's just music and visuals. And I never even thought about that at the time, that was quite an unusual thing for an animation.
It's interesting to me how when you have something where all you're doing is looking at images and there's music, how you still get the story and you still get the emotion. And sometimes the music creates the emotion. You can have a static image on the screen and play a different melody or a different chord with that image, and people will interpret it differently.
Yeah, completely. And I know that you're kind of interested in film scores, and one of your previous podcasts talked about the Force theme from Star Wars. And I think Star Wars is a really good example of something which that kind of emotional quality that you're talking about is carried almost entirely by the music.
On television, I remember seeing this documentary about John Williams where they show him walking up or down a staircase. And while he's walking up or down the staircase, they're playing the Raiders of the Lost Ark march. And then they play exactly the same video, but they put the Jaws theme to it.
Oh, wow.
And it's a trick that they play that works amazingly well because you don't really think about the fact that it's exactly the same visual.
Yeah.
But your mood, your idea of how the person is walking, how he himself is walking up the stairs, his motivation, the way your brain interprets what his intentions are and what his mood is, they completely change just by changing the theme that you're listening to as you're watching him do this very simple act. And there's nothing going on except he's walking up the stairs, but you put different music to it. And suddenly the mood is entirely different. He's either going to murder somebody or he's going to save somebody, and you don't know which it is unless you're watching and listening to the music. And animated stories that have little or no sound. I think the earliest cartoons that have very little vocals are extremely entertaining without necessarily using any words or using very, very few words. And that, to me, it's a fascinating thing, the way that our brains work. It's as if there's an entirely different channel that's taking in the music than is taking in the words and the visuals. It's as if it's bypassing our conscious awareness somehow and giving us these feelings behind the scenes that we're very often not even aware what it is that's giving us a feeling. Unless we're used to paying attention to film scores the way that I try to, at least on the second watching. I try to watch a film and watch it without paying attention to the music as much as possible the first time through. And then the second time, I try and actively pay attention to the music.
I think it's really interesting the way that actually getting the, as it were, the amount of score or the complexity of score right has such a kind of impact, because like we're saying, those Star Wars scores, and I think of those kind of Looney Tunes cartoons or whatever, where, as you say, there's very little dialogue, they require loads and loads of kind of score. And actually there are other scenes where, 3 or 4 notes will do the job on its own.
Or just a chord or a tiny little instrumental sound, whether it's like high strings or low rumble or something like that. We have this audio language that we are, I think partly we're biologically attuned to. Sometimes it's like the growl of a predator is something that we relate to and that scares us, or the sound of somebody crying. Usually a baby crying, it's a high, kind of pealing sound, and that's something that affects us too. So I think part of it's biological and part of it's cultural, and it's just completely fascinating. Tell me more about your background. What has influenced your music creation and composition style?
So my parents both loved music. My mum played the piano and my dad had this enormous record collection, but it was really kind of polarized, his musical taste. So half his record collection was kind of Renaissance polyphony, kind of loads of Palestrina and William Byrd and that kind of thing. And the other half of his collection was late romantic music, particularly kind of Strauss and Mahler symphonies. So I kind of grew up in a house where, music was playing all the time. Both my siblings were musical. And things that I particularly kind of early recordings that I remember that kind of really stuck in my head were, there was a guy in the 60s in the UK, David Munro, who performed all this kind of Praetorius, kind of right at the very beginning of that kind of early music movement. And that was a great record. And I remember that as being one of the kind of earliest records I can remember. Andre Previn's recording of Walton's First Symphony, massive influence. I love that piece and I love that recording. And I think that symphony is one of the few pieces of music where it seems there's not a wasted moment. Like, it's 45 minutes of duration. There's not a moment which feels stretched. The pacing is absolutely perfect, particularly in the first movement, which just kind of keeps going and going. And then another recording I remember was on the kind of B side of Rodrigo's, I can never pronounce this, Concierto de Aranjuez, was his concert serenade for harp as well, which is a really, really great piece, which is a piece that I never know is not better known, actually. So those are kind of the first recordings I remember.
Something I haven't really thought to ask too much, but I think I will start asking the guest composers on, is what is your process for composing? How do you start a composition, and what do you use to come up with your ideas and then to progress and build a composition?
So that's a really, really good question. It's not something I ever give that much thought to, actually, unless kind of being forced to think about that. So I think I'm not really a performer. So I know my way around the piano, but I'm not really a pianist. So I'm definitely not a kind of composer, performer person. But I definitely do need a piano around, because I think, not least that composing is such a kind of solitary experience that having the piano there to, as a friend, I suppose, is a really important part of that. So one thing I'm really conscious of, not having been a kind of composer performer, that I think of, this is kind of looking at it retrospectively rather than, I'm not conscious of this at the time, but I think I'm often trying to recreate how musical experiences felt for me. So that doesn't necessarily mean kind of quoting things, although I have done that before, but it's kind of trying to recreate what that feeling was for me, which might be very different from how someone else here's that piece. So I will often start with melody. Like I think a friend of mine once said, composer friend of mine once said that composers generally fall into two categories. One who kind of starts with harmony, kind of starts with chords, and I mean I'm kind of being really simplistic here, and one who kind of starts as a melody composer. I'm definitely, I think, on the melody side of things. So I often start with kind of melodic material. I will often start with text, even if it's not a kind of vocal piece. I will often start with text as being the initial idea, and maybe, sometimes the rhythms of those texts. Again, we talked about John Williams. A lot of those instrumental pieces, like the Superman score, has the rhythm of the word Superman built into it. And again, not necessarily super conscious of that. I'm not sure I've really answered your question, but I think probably I start with a motif or a melodic idea. And one of the things I try to do, though I'm not always good at this, is to look at that melody from different perspectives. Look at it kind of, Nico Muhly would say, write 1,000 variations on that idea and then pick the 2 or 3 things that work. I can't say I'm always good at that, but I often am doing calculations in my head about how that might work.
Speaking from my own experience, the process very often disappears from my memory, but when I'm paying attention to it, very often I will go through a number of different variations on a motif or a melody in my head, or very quickly at the piano, because like you say, I compose at the piano. I am a pianist, and I like the idea that for you, your piano is sort of your emotional support animal while you're
yes,
composing.
That's it.
But my composition very often has been at the piano, and I will play the same thing 5 or 10 or 15 times in slightly different ways. And I will play, as I'm composing, I'll play a piece over and over and over again, and I'll make slight variations as I'm doing it until I find exactly what it is that I'm trying to get in my sound. So that's a familiar experience for me, is the idea of creating a number of different variations and then picking the ones that you want. And I think the process happens as you are more and more practiced in composing. I think that happens more quickly and subconsciously, or as an aside, than something that happens as a conscious exercise of actually writing down that many different variations and then looking at all of them. And I think as we get better at these things, a lot more of it happens on a subconscious or a very rapid mental level.
Definitely, I think. Because one thing I find, I don't know if you find this, but often if an idea doesn't come that easily, sometimes you work on it and it really works. But sometimes that means that, for me, that actually fundamentally there's something that doesn't work. And one of the things I find kind of frustrating, I suppose, about composing is this idea that when you're planning a piece, and I will often kind of do a kind of little sketch of where I want it to go, and kind of some ideas for each section, like just kind of written words and some lines and some hairpins and all of that kind of thing. But one of the things I think that's really kind of frustrating about composing is at the point at which you start, you can't predict whether what you hope will happen 10 minutes later in the piece is going to happen. And sometimes something different happens, and that's great. And sometimes you get there and you think, actually, you put quite a lot of work into something that maybe isn't going to work.
I understand it's sort of the same with authors who are writing a story, that very often the characters of the story, for want of a better phrase, the characters of the story will not want to do what the author is telling them to do. And the characters will decide to do something different as part of the process. And I find that happens with melodies or compositions in general, that as I'm composing them, they are telling me what they want to be and not necessarily agreeing with what I want them to be.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. And actually, sometimes there's the kind of serendipitous nature of things that you weren't expecting would work well together. 5-10 minutes down the line, suddenly are working well together. And that's really exciting.
Of course, one of the questions I do ask is, are you a film score fan?
So I do love film scores, and I have some particular favorites, and I know we sort of covered this already, but one film score that really sticks out for me is the Empire Strikes Back film score, particularly because I feel that That's the point where John Williams is really, really comfortable with that whole kind of leitmotifs thing. And all the melodies are like perfectly constructed. You hear, a rising perfect fourth, and all I hear is the fourth theme. And, and I think the great thing about using, for a composer, listening to that score in particular and thinking about kind of using leitmotifs, is hearing the same melodies in different contexts and expressing different things. So you've got the melody's intrinsic character, and then you've got kind of everything that happens around it, orchestration, harmonizing it, the register, and all of those kind of things. And you hear it completely differently, and yet you know it. I think that's amazing, and a great thing for a composer, kind of listening to those different contexts.
And it has some of the most iconic tracks of any film score. The asteroid field, as an example. Yeah. I was trying to think of any other piece of music that is significantly like the asteroid field. And I can't think of any piece of music that has quite all of the things that has in it. Therefore, I call it iconic. It's its own thing. It's recognizable as its own thing. And that the Imperial March, which has similarities to a lot of other marches, but is also it's very much its own thing between both the rhythmic motifs and the melodic and harmonic movement in it. It's another fantastic piece. But the entire score, it is definitely, of all of the Star Wars scores, that one is my absolute favorite. And I agree, it's the one where John Williams was completely in stride. He wasn't necessarily feeling like he had to imitate what was in the temp score that George Lucas had put to it in Star Wars. So he had the freedom to create this big operatic score that really was its own identity. And that's absolutely one of my all-time favorite scores. I love listening to it from beginning to end. I love listening to individual tracks from it. It's always fun listening to recordings of different tracks by different orchestras. Sometimes it feels like it's a train wreck when you listen to an orchestra performing some of the music in that, because a lot of that music is very, very hard.
Really challenging, yeah. And the interesting thing is, I think the original recording, the London Symphony Orchestra, and I mean this in a good way, they sound quite rough, and it sounds quite raw, and it doesn't quite have that, maybe what you'd call that Hollywood sheen. It's quite kind of a raw, unpolished sound. And I think that's amazing. Like, that's one of the things, and it matches that kind of those early Star Wars films visuals as well, that it was very dirty and grimy and didn't have the kind of 1970s sci-fi sheen. It
sounds passionate. The players sound like they were emotional as they were playing it, as much as anything else. I think all three of the original scores have that quality to them to a degree. And I feel as the scores progressed, and as the budget increased, and as the technology increased, I feel like something got a little bit over polished in the scores as they continued.
I also, particularly in The Empire Strikes Back, there are some things on the kind of original soundtrack which don't seem to occur on the film.
Mm-hmm. Some of the stuff on the score, I believe, was concert arrangements of the music instead of being specific to the score. Because that's something else that John Williams does, is he'll do a concert arrangement of his music, which is just fantastic. The other thing I would think about for those films is those were probably the only three of the films that were guaranteed to have been recorded on tape instead of digitally. Of
course, yeah.
I would think that the ones in the 90s were probably done digitally, whereas those would have been recorded on tape, and that provides a different sound quality. It's the difference between listening to music, like rock music from the 60s and the 70s, and listening to music that's produced today. There's a quality that happens in the recording to tape that they're trying to emulate now, and there are tools that emulate that sound. But it was something that was just kind of raw and natural, and it was a limitation, but it was a limitation that was used at the time.
So it's funny you should say that, because one of the other film scores that really sticks in my head is the Simon and Garfunkel score to The Graduate, which definitely has that very, very raw sound. And in fact, all of their recordings from the 60s and 70s have a kind of often quite an unusual sound world. Like I always think the end of The Boxer has, I can't work out what some of those noises are. It sounds like a kind of contra baritone sax at one point, and the way it's recorded. But yeah, I love those, those folk-inspired melodies in The Graduate, and the way, it's just kind of sounds exactly like they're sitting there in your kind of living room.
It is interesting, all of the different aspects of recording and producing music and sharing music. I'm composing as much as possible for live performance to try and get as many people involved in the music as possible. And at the same time, I've done a lot of composing directly to recording on computer, creating an entire ensemble and recording it without having anybody else involved but myself. And I have also done recording in studio. When I was learning recording, I was learning recording with tape, and my studio instructor was so excited because there was this new digital recording that was going to be happening, and it was just around the corner, and it was going to change how everything worked, and it certainly did. But the technology shift created a different sound as well in a lot of ways, and created a different process for creating sounds. Let's go ahead and take a break, and then we will come back and talk about the melody that we'll be discussing in this podcast. Welcome back to the Melodology podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. I'm here today with Richard Peat, and we are going to be talking about a melody that is a very simple melody, but has a lot going on in it. This melody is called Down in Yon Forest. Here's from the Wikipedia page. Down in Yon Forest, also known as All Bells in Paradise and Castleton Carol, is a traditional English Christmas carol dating to the Renaissance era, ultimately deriving from the anonymous Middle English poem known today as the Corpus Christi Carol. The song was originally associated with Good Friday or the Corpus Christi feast rather than Christmas, but some more recent variants have some additional verses which reference Christmas. Multiple audio recordings have been made of this song, particularly in the town of Castleton, Derbyshire, England, where the famous composer and folk song collector Ralph Vaughan Williams encountered and transcribed a version sung by Mr. J. Hall in 1908. Like many English folk songs, it seems to have naturally made its way to the United States, where several traditional singers, including Jean Ritchie, have been recorded singing the song. This is an interesting piece of music. I'm going to point out right now, it does have a number of verses, and the structure of the verses all are 4 lines. The first and third line are different in each verse, but then the second and fourth lines are the same no matter what. So it's always the first line and third line are different, and then the second line would be, the bells of paradise, I heard them ring, and the fourth line is, and I love my Lord Jesus above anything. So that is the structure of it, and I was saying offline to you, Rick, that this to me comes across as sort of like a drinking song, because it has that repeated element of line 2 and line 4 are always exactly the same, and then line 1 and line 3 reference something each differently in each different verse. And it's kind of, I would say it's fairly easy to come up with different verses for this, because you have to come up with 2 lines, and you have part of you have half of the music or half of the lyrics written for you already. Tell me about your experience with this piece.
So I can remember really clearly where I first heard this. My parents had a tape that was called Enchanted Carols. And this was a mixture of different things, but it was mainly recordings of mechanical instruments from this museum in Devon, which is in the southwest of England. And I have no recollection of going to the museum, although my parents tell me I did, but I do remember this tape. And in fact, I remember in my dad's car, for a long time, it was the only tape he had. And so he had it on kind of at totally wrong time of the year. But one of the things on it was a handbell choir, and a choir singing this. I think it is the Vaughan Williams arrangement of it that's in the Oxford Book of Carols, but with these handbell sounds on top. And it was the most amazing sound because you got both this carol in quite a kind of basic harmonization where the melody was kind of key, but you got all these overtones from the sounds of ringing handbells on top of that. And I think that it had a huge influence on me kind of right from an early age. And I think we talked before about one of the things I try to do as a composer is often to recreate an experience that I've had. And I think that the experience of all those handbells and the overtones and this melody kind of was really profound, I think.
I believe I have a link to the YouTube recording of that, and then I'll put that in the program notes. But this melody, because it's simple, it allows you to do a lot of layering on top of it. And if you just had the melody all by itself, it's beautiful and it's poignant, but you can take it and kind of run in any different direction that you want with it. It is very much kind of a carol or song structure. It's an AABA structure as far as the music goes. And it's very straightforward and simple, but it's also very catchy. It's very easy to sing, we'll see. And as we look at it, we'll see that it's very well written as well. I think part of what makes a carol something that is around for years and years and years is that even if it looks really simple, there's some expertise or some magic that has been put into it that makes it a very particularly special piece of music.
Yeah, definitely. And I think all those traditional carols that we think of, they have that quality to them.
So let's go ahead and take a look at the melody. What we're going to do, as usual, we're just going to walk along the melody as if we have never seen it before and examine what it is that we see as we're going step by step. So what are you seeing so far with this melody or hearing?
So what I hear is turning round the kind of the tonic. And what I find kind of really interesting is that this doesn't travel very far. I mean, it essentially travels from A to B, but that seems like quite an extraordinary journey in this.
Wait, yeah. And just to point out, so the people who are listening to this, you might not realize that this is in A minor, and Rick literally is pointing to the fact that it starts on A, and the note that phrase ends on is B. So it's not just going from point A to point B, it's going literally from note A to note B. And yeah, it does that very singable thing of so far every single movement is by a single step.
Yeah, completely stepwise all the way. And again, when you get to the note of the second phrase, that descending fifth seems like an enormous chasm in that context. And I also think it kind of makes me, that melodic shape of kind of moving just by step and not going very far makes me think of plain chant as well.
And looking at the melody so far, we kind of have, if we're going to talk in terms of motifs, and by the way, if you're listening to this podcast, we are looking at the notes on a screen, and if you would like to see what it is we're talking about, the video is available for Patreon patrons at patreon.com/melody podcast. But we're looking at these notes, and looking at them, I can see, without necessarily realizing I heard these things, I can see two kind of different motifs that are happening here. We have just a step away and back, a step up and down in the first three notes. The second set of three notes is an upward scale. The third set of three notes is a downward scale. And maybe a little bit of a stretch, but the last three notes of the first phrase are another set of a step away from the note. So in this case, a step down and back up. So I'm seeing repeated patterns here, even though so far we've only got 10 notes. There are repeated patterns in those 10 notes.
Yeah, you've got the ascending and descending scalic motif, and then you've got that kind of ascending and descending three notes. And that's a thing, I think, in Renaissance music, isn't it? I can't remember what it's called, that going up and back to kind of from the tonic to the supertonic. You get it in a lot of kind of Dowland lute songs, I think. In Darkness Let Me Dwell does that.
A lot of times, as we're talking about melodies, we're talking about how they rise or fall. This one has, as the melody has progressed so far, it's reached up as high as the third of the scale, but it's stopping at 2. So it's basically gone from 1 to 2. And so it's got upward motion, but it does, between the fact that it's in 6/8, so it has these groups of 3 beats or 3 notes that kind of give it that lilting, fluid feel to it. It's not a waltz, but it's got that sort of, the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That adds some sort of a hypnotic nature to the up and down of the notes.
Yeah, and it's that meter, that kind of compound meter, that I think makes it slightly unusual for a folk song, and certainly is the thing that takes it beyond plain chant, having that lilting meter that you pointed to. That's the thing that makes this quite distinctive, I think.
Yeah, so the second phrase is almost it's exactly the same as the first phrase, although it has a note that leads into it. And the end of the first phrase, then you drop down that leap of a fifth down to the note that leads into the second line. So let's go ahead and listen to just the first 2 lines together. Exactly the same pattern repeated twice. I do know in some situations, people performing this will play the second phrase with slightly different chords.
Yeah, and in fact, there are versions where the melody is different. So there are versions where, like, there's an anacrusis in this version between the first and the second phrase, and there are others where they will begin, instead of down in yon forest, it'll be down in yon forest. So they'll start with an anacrusis, and they'll change the emphasis so that the kind of, it's the word in that happens on the first beat of the bar as well.
And for the non-musical folks who are listening, and give a full definition of an anacrusis, because it's one of those words that we use, but we don't necessarily think of when we're talking to other people. And people's eyes roll back in their head when I start using musical terms all over the place. So explain that one.
So in the UK, I don't know if you call it this in the States as well, we would also call it an upbeat. So it's basically, you think of most melodic phrases or most melodies will start on the first beat of the bar. This is like a melody that starts a beat early or a note early. It has a little like introductory note before the main melody. So in this case, the version we have here where it starts on the beat, it goes down in yon forest, whereas the version with the upbeat or the anacrusis would go down in yon forest. So you've got down in and the down, that's the upbeat or the anacrusis.
Right.
Did that make sense?
That made perfect sense. And that's also, it's funny because when we start explaining musical terms, it sometimes takes us down a rabbit hole. So you have an upbeat and a downbeat. And that's another thing that I don't necessarily know that we've explained on the podcast. The downbeat is when you are counting the beats of a measure, the downbeat is 1. That's the downbeat. And an upbeat is, and this comes also with the way that music is conducted. When a conductor is indicating the beat before the downbeat, he brings his hands up. And then the downbeat, he brings his hands down. So that is a literal interpretation, visual interpretation of the upbeat and the downbeat. But those are the terms that we're referring to here. The beginning of the melody, as we're looking at it and listening to it here, there is no upbeat at the very beginning, but there's an upbeat in the second phrase to bring in the start of the phrase before the actual next measure. The bells of paradise, I heard them ring, is that second line. And again, that second line, the words are always the same in every single verse of this when it's sung as a carol. And we've emphasized by playing the melody or singing the melody exactly the same way the second time in this case, other than that upbeat. It's going to establish that in somebody's mind. You've already heard the same pattern now twice. And musically, almost everybody is good enough at singing and good enough about hearing a melody and being able to catch on to it that after they've heard something this simple twice, they're probably going to be able to sing along with it as well.
Yeah, I think there are two things that make this melody really kind of singable. The one is that repetition. So essentially the first, second and third phrase are the same. And it's that moving by step most of the time. It's moving to the next available note and not leaping to the note. And it's always moving by step is something that makes things so singable.
Well, let's go ahead and listen to the third phrase of this carol. So that now is completely different, but it has a lot of things in it that are similar. So in the beginning, we've got a motif that is a step away and a step back. And in this case, it starts out in A, goes up to B, goes back down to A. Now that we've gotten into this third phrase, we have the same pattern, but it's turned upside down.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's beautiful about this is that, in a way, the first, second, and third phrases are quite static. They stay around the same notes. They twist and turn around the same notes, mostly the kind of the first and second degrees of the scale. But here, it's like the music just blossoms out, and it's got this beautiful shape that kind of rises higher and higher and higher, and then falls back again.
And it does. It's going step by step. So far in the melody, we've gone A to B, and then we've gone A to B again. And the highest we've reached is just kind of bouncing off of that third note of the scale, bouncing off of the C. But then when we get to this third phrase, it starts at C, goes up a step to D, and then goes up a step to E, which is the 5 of our scale. So we've gone up the 5 notes of our minor scale here. And we've also done it in a way, using that step away motif, this melody now is building tension up to each next note because it goes down and then it goes up and it goes down a little bit and then it goes up again by using that step down as sort of a rebounding point to bring itself up to the next higher note. It adds energy and it adds excitement in a very simple, straightforward way to get to each higher note.
And again, as you say, it doesn't use much to get there. We've got very little new material, only that kind of A minor arpeggio right at the end. But it's kind of taken that material and used it in the service, I suppose, of something emotional, an emotional climax. That's what it's done. It's taken the opening idea and developed it.
And it's also, I think it's taken something that has been very static and very, wandering around the main, the first 2 notes of the scale, and it's turned it into something that has motion. Using the same exact structure, it's turned it into something that's moving farther away. And I'm going to play that again just so you could hear how that sounds. Another thing that I want to point out here too, in the first phrase and the second phrase, you have the first 3 notes are the step away and step back, but then the second set of 3 notes is a scale up, 3 notes in one direction, and then the notes after that are 3 notes in a downward direction. Now, at the peak of this piece, we get all the way up to that 5 of the scale, and we have 3 notes going down in one direction as that kind of repeat of a pattern, but it's been stretched out, and now it's going 5, 3, 1. It's leaping by thirds downward instead of going by steps downward. So we've gone from everything other than jumping to the upbeat and using that upbeat as an interval. We've had every single step of this piece of music has been by step. Every single note has been step by step. And now we have an arpeggio downward.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is, as well as that arpeggio, which is totally new, we haven't really had that idea before, the ending, and I imagine you were going to come on to this, so I'm sorry to steal your thunder, the ending on the G sharp is quite a dramatic moment because it also kind of moves away from what you might say are the folk origins, the kind of, to use another kind of musical term, those kind of modal, it's kind of Aeolian mode, it's that kind of very folk song collection of notes, to having a G sharp, which is quite a kind of classical, in the kind of broader sense, classical music idea of that, what we'd call a raised seventh.
Yes, and in this case, to do a little bit of musical terminology, when you have a minor scale, the minor scale has a lowered sixth and a lowered seventh, and that basically, in the image that I've created, that I share sometimes, of a scale looking like steps on a stairway, and the notes of the chord being landings on that stairway, you have a half a step between one step and another. It's an easy step to take. So if you're going up the scale, and say we're using a major scale, sixth and seventh are what we call raised. That means the seventh note of the scale is just a half step away from getting back up to that octave, back up to the home note. And it's really easy to get back up, to go up that half step. And in minor, with those both lowered, the sixth is lowered and it's a half step away from the fifth. So it's easier to go down from that sixth down to that fifth. It's a closer step. So in some ways, it just feels easier to make that half step motion to get to a note that's in our chord than to take a whole step or to take a leap. And leaps are easier because you're going from landing to landing, and there's kind of a more solid space to land. But that half step gives you something different. In music theory, you have what's called the harmonic minor scale. And that's because if you play the minor scale going upward, you don't have that half step between 7 and 8. That leads you up to the main note of the chord again, literally a leading tone to take you that half step up and bring you back home to the top note. You have a whole step, so it's a little bit farther to go. So a solution to that musically was to raise the sixth and the seventh when you're going up the scale. As you're going up the scale, you get that raised sixth, that raised seventh that takes you up to the main note. But then when you're going down the scale, you can lower the sixth and the seventh, and it makes going down easier. And it keeps your notes the same. In this case, we have that G sharp, that leading tone, going down. So instead of landing up at the high note and staying up at the high note, the fifth of the scale, we go down an arpeggio, and then we go down to a note that we haven't been to yet. So it's this kind of surprising place to land. And in music theory terms, it's using the sixth and seventh of the scale raised, but in a downward motion, which I think is also a very interesting and unique kind of surprise in this piece. We don't stay at the top note. We go down, and rather than landing at the note that we've already been on when we've gone down from the A, now we end up on a G sharp, which is a surprise.
It's really interesting, I think, because then going down to that raised sixth as well, and the F sharp, it tells us that the direction of travel is to land back on that A at love. So normally as you explained really, really beautifully, normally we'd kind of think of going down the minor scale as flattening that seventh and sixth on the way down, but actually it's kept sharp here because the direction of travel, even though it looks like it's going down, it's really just going back to that A, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. So back to the force theme, we were talking about how that jumps up, going up and up the arpeggio, but every time you go to the next note, you're first dropping down to a note one farther down. So you're creating a bigger leap to get higher each time. And in this case, it's sort of like that. We've landed on that leading tone, and the leading tone really is saying we're going back to that A. This is the first time that we have landed on the 7 in the scale and stayed there.
Yeah.
Previously, we've just bounced off of it. Now we're hitting 7 and we're landing there, and it is an indication that we are going back to the home note, even though we have this little escape down, farther down, that takes us back down to 5 and up to 1 again. It really is functional here that 7th note is raised to emphasize getting back to our home melody.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about this more, I think, when we talk about the kind of the overall structure of it. But it has such a kind of beautiful, dramatic shape within the space of 20 seconds or whatever it takes for the melody to be sung through. It just has that lovely kind of It's like so much is contained with so little material.
This is very concise melody writing here, where you're using just a minimum of notes and motifs, but you're getting a lot out of it.
Yeah.
And I do find it interesting. It gets all the way up to the top and then it drops without staying there up at the top. So it's not as if it's an exciting, triumphal achievement. It's, it's going upward and it reaches the height, but then it takes you to this point where it's taking you back home very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it even looks like a bridge or, a rainbow, that kind of rising to the top and then falling back down again.
Well, let's go ahead and play that part, and then we'll play out the last phrase, which is close to a repeat of the first two phrases. We again have that upward step and then back down and then the rising scale. But then we have that step away for the very, the last measure of this melody. We have the step away and back, and it's a repeat of how we reversed it. It was a downward step and back up rather than going down to the A and coming back up to the B. Now we're using this very familiar motif that we have of one step away and back, and then dropping down to the home note. So we haven't got any new material as far as motifs or structure, but it's been used in a new way that will drop us at the home note instead of taking us to a different note away on the scale, either taking us to 2 or taking us down to 7.
And that seemingly innocuous kind of change of just 2 notes, isn't it? It makes the world of difference. It's the answered question.
Mm-hmm. And this is something, as a composer, very often I will find myself having a string of notes, and I know functionally I have to have it do something different. It has to be a question instead of being an answer, or vice versa. And examples like this, where all you're doing is changing one note in the series, it lets you escape from the pattern that you had created previously. Changing one thing in, maybe this is a lesson for life. Changing just one thing lets you change the pattern that you have been stuck in or you've been repeating, and it lets you do something completely different.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you were saying before about, so not only is the repetition in those opening phrases makes it easy to sing, but it also makes it easy to understand. So from a kind of music psychology perspective, our brain can make sense of it. And that's what I love about the shape of this. You describe it as AABA dash, I suppose, or something like that, is this idea that when we hear this melody, this 2-bar phrase again at the end, we're like, oh, this is our old friend, we know this. And then we're like, oh, but actually, everything's become resolved now. Everything's fine. We've ended up on the tonic.
And I think listening to this, I think part of the fact that we have this cultural language of music. And I think we have an understanding when you have you have this AABA sort of a structure. We have an understanding that the first 2 A's are part of the question. The B takes us a step away. And if we go back to A, that it's going to be an ending instead of being a continuation. We know this as just as poetry, you get to the end of the poem and you're going to have the final line of the poem and it's going to have a period at the end of it. This musically has a period at the end of it versus being a line with a comma at the end that continues into the next line. You get to this phrase and it's going to be punctuated with an ending.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, melody that's 8 bars long is like a kind of microcosm for much bigger musical structures. If you think of like sonata form, if you think like Beethoven's Egmont Overture, that does essentially this. You have that kind of opening material, you've got the exposition, and then you've got this development, which could be seen as that third phrase, and then you've got the recapitulation that comes back at the end. And it's the same in kind of all those kind of 32-bar song form jazz songs as well, which are all kind of AABA. All these pieces make a similar journey.
Oh, you've taken us into the rabbit hole again, so I'm going to go ahead and explain a couple things. No, it's absolutely fantastic. I love it when this happens. You mentioned sonata form. Sonata form is a larger structure of a piece of music that has, in its most common form, I would say, or its most traditional form, it has the statement of a melody, then it has a statement of a secondary melody. And very often there's just a straight up repeat of both of those. So you get those firmly established in your mind as you're listening to this whole piece of music. We're not just talking about a single melody, we're talking about an entire work. So you have a melody, then you have a different melody that's either slower or a different personality to it. And then you repeat those two melodies. So the listener has a really good idea of what it is that they've heard. And then the next part of sonata form is the development section. So you move into this section where the composer takes different ideas out of the two melodies and plays with them, tears them apart, puts them back together, rearranges them, moves them around, and develops the material that is in the main melodies of the sonata form. And then at the end, the first two melodies, the main two melodies of the sonata form, come back. And they generally come back slightly different, just like in this smaller format where we have the last two bars end with a period. The traditional ending with a sonata form is to have the first melody and the second melody coming back in the same key in a way that it ends the piece more solidly. So you again have sort of a question at the beginning. I didn't mention this earlier. In the sonata form, the first melody is traditionally in the key, and then the second melody is not in the same key. It's usually down perhaps on the fifth. It could be on some other scale within the key, but it isn't on the same scale. So you have built into the structure of the two melodies, you have a question kind of a format. You're going to say 1 to 5. And you go 1 to 5 twice the first time you play through it, then you have this development that takes you completely away. And then when you come back, the last time you repeat those two melodies, the traditional form puts the second melody back into the main key to solidly keep you in the main key and to give you an ending so that it's a statement at the ending instead of leaving you with a question. And you're right, this melody does exactly that in 8 bars. You have two ideas. You have the up and down motion and then a scale, and you have that repeat. It repeats twice, and it's ending on a question each time. It's ending sort of on a 5 chord each time. And then you have this spot where you're using those same two motifs, but you're developing them. You're going away from where you started and doing things a little bit differently. And then you come back and you have exactly the same material, but the material is adjusted slightly. The second part of it especially is adjusted slightly so you have an ending.
That was brilliantly explained, yes.
And it was a brilliant observation. That was just a fantastic observation that is something that works in a microcosm here, and it also works in a larger structure, that you have these kinds of formats that I think the idea behind the sonata form is that you are sharing something and you want to make sure that the person understands it. So you share it twice, and then you expand on it, you talk about it, you riff on it, you discuss it, and then you come back and you reemphasize your point at the end. And it's sort of a straightforward idea that has became this traditional structure of different works of music.
And I think forms of that structure work their way through so much music. You have to very consciously work against that, I think, that kind of formula in one way or another. If you want your music to be kind of understood, it's very hard to kind of run away from that idea and still keep it. And, lots of composers has, but it's amazing how you look at so many pieces of music and they do some form of that, however sophisticated it is and however much kind of variation the recapitulation has, it often has some form of that form that you just described.
And the only piece of music that we've discussed that I can even think of as a song form that does not do that is Be Thou My Vision, that Garrett Hope and I discussed back in episode 2, where he pointed out his fascination with it is partly because it breaks these rules. It doesn't have repeated motifs. It has similarities in it, but it doesn't repeat the same thing over and over again. And it kind of breaks the rules of what your expectations are as you're going through it. Whereas this piece does completely the opposite. It has two motivic elements. It has the step up and back, and then it has three notes in one direction. And that's really it as far as motifs in this. And it repeats them, and there's not really much of anything else in the entire piece. And it repeats them very solidly with three phrases that are almost exactly the same, and then one phrase that uses the same elements but uses them slightly differently to take you to a different place. Anything else about this melody that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, the only other thing I'd say is that it's about its impact, really. And I know I said this before, but it's how much it achieves with so little material. And I think I'm always striving in compositions to do that. And I know that probably my strongest pieces are the pieces where there aren't many ideas, but those ideas can say a lot and can say a lot in different ways. I think when students often kind of are starting out with composition, their default setting is to think that they have to keep creating more material and new material and move. And I love pieces which have that economy of material, and this certainly has that.
I think the only other thing that keeps occurring to me is it's got this lilting feeling that leans back and forth, and that rocking back and forth adds a sort of a hypnotic element to the melody.
100%. And in fact, that is the perfect word for it, actually, hypnotic. And I think the version that I first became aware, that version we talked about right at the beginning, the version with the Dartington Hall Choir and the handbells, really leaned into that hypnotic quality that you described. That I love the use of that word hypnotic. It's perfect for this.
And to be able to achieve that with such an economy of notes it's just amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and take another break, and we will come back and we will listen to some music that you've brought for us today. Welcome back to the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. My name is Arthur Breur. I am your host, and I am here today with Richard Peat. Richard, this part of the podcast is about you, so tell us what you've brought for us to listen to.
So I've bought a couple of pieces, and I bought a third if we have the time. So the first piece is a piece called Winter Landscape. And the reason I bought this piece is because it uses that tune that we've been thinking about, Down in Yon Forest. And it uses it as, and I'm going to use another technical term now, as a cantus firmus. So a melody that runs through the piece over which other things happen. And you kind of preempted this earlier in the podcast when you said, the great thing about this melody is that you can do so much with it. So this piece attempts to do this. So it's like in this piece, the melody is used as like an immovable object over which lots of other things happen. And what inspired this piece was this painting, which I absolutely love, which is Caspar David Friedrich's Winter Landscape, which hangs in the National Gallery in London. And it depicts this very wintry scene with a cathedral in the distance and a man on crutches and a big sort of crucifix as well. And this piece is an attempt to kind of well, I suppose it's my musical reaction to it. It's not what you might call programmatic. It's not kind of depicting the scene, but actually the Down in Yon Forest carol is a little bit like, the words are a little bit like the sort of scene in a Friedrich painting. So I think that's why the two became kind of interconnected in my head.
All right, well, let's listen to Winter Landscape. This is an extract of Winter Landscape by Richard Peat. definitely creates emotion. And because when I listen to music, I always see certain things and certain ideas. And just with the combination of the name Winter Landscape and that sound, there's this idea in my brain of seeing a very stark winter landscape, but it's almost as if within that, hidden within that, or behind that, there are people who are continuing to sing the carol to comfort themselves and warm themselves while this starkness is around them. It's sort of the dream scene that happens in my mind listening to it. It is very evocative in terms of evoking emotion specifically.
I'm very glad to hear that. I'm glad that's how you experienced it, and that's very, very similar to, I think, what I was trying to achieve. And I think if you look at the Friedrich painting, that's how I see it. You've got the kind of warmth of the carol and those beautiful kind of voices singing the carol against this very kind of much more a sort of abrasive, desolate, kind of bleak, chromatic material. Lots of notes that don't belong in that scale.
You've also brought some very different moods in some other choral music. Tell us about the next piece you'd like to share.
So I chose, I would say this is one of my most unusual pieces, I Am Not There. And the reason I chose it for this podcast is it is essentially all melody. So it sets this poem by Mary Elizabeth Fry, and it has a chord sequence underneath it, which is a little bit like a kind of pop song chord sequence in the way that it keeps repeating the same, I think it's 8 bars over and over again. And above that, this melody kind of starts out with a very sort of limited range, and it just expands out and expands out and expands out. So you've got the vocal melody, and then you've also got what we would call a counter melody in the right hand of the organ. So that's a second melody on top of the first, but that has sort of equal prominence. As I say, I chose this because it's kind of all melody.
Well, let's listen to this. This is I Am Not There by Richard Peat. That's beautiful. As I was listening to it, I was thinking, what a really interesting choice to use a choir as a solo instrument, where you just have the one note being sung by everybody all the way through. But then at the climax of the piece, you have harmonies that are suddenly being sung, and it just shines out in that moment. It just separates out that moment like sunlight through the clouds.
Oh, that's really kind. Yeah, I think enhanced enormously by the Ely Cathedral Girls Choir, who are such a fantastic choir. And one thing that was really nice is that they also seem to really enjoy singing it as well, because that's not always the case with contemporary music.
It seems, as I was listening to it, and was noticing that it's written to be sung. It's
Yeah.
very cantabile, very much with the step by step leaps within the chords. It didn't have any moments that felt like they were a stretch to sing, which was very comforting to listen to, and I'm sure that also makes it comforting to sing.
Yeah, I hope so. And yeah, it does. It did seem to kind of is one of those things. We were talking before about pieces that don't come easily may kind of never come easily. And this is a piece that did come easily. Like it did, like the ideas very quickly, and all those things we were talking about at the beginning about those sort of calculations, those sort of subconscious calculations that you're doing, they all came very easily, all kind of fitted together very quickly, and was quite kind of easy to kind of realize and write down.
Certainly nice when that does happen.
It doesn't always.
I would say it happens much less often. That's the minor percentage of times when I'm composing when something just happens.
Yeah,
It's
yes, I'm with you there.
rewarding and fun when it does happen, but you just can't expect that it's going to happen. Most composing is work.
It
It's
is.
just, it's a slog and it's frustrating, and you have moments where you have no idea how something is going to happen, and you work at it and work at it and work at it until you get there. And it is really nice when something just flows and happens very, very easily.
Yeah, but I agree with you. It's rare. 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, as my old composition teacher used to say.
So, how much perspiration was there in Tread Softly, the third piece that you're going to share?
Again, it was a piece actually that, I mean, it benefits enormously from setting the right poem, I think. And the reason I brought this piece along was because it's actually based on a very short, all the music is based essentially on a very short melody. So you hear that for the first time in the altos going from measure 6 into measure 7. So it's essentially a 3-bar melody with an anacrusis, an upbeat, as we were talking about before. And that runs through the whole piece. And it's both a refrain, so it keeps coming back, and it's also used as the basis for, as it were, the episodes, the bits in between that refrain. And yeah, the thing I like about this piece is it's really, really tightly constructed over a very small amount of material.
Well, let's listen to Tread Softly. That is beautiful. It has so many dissonances in it, and so much of the sound is overlapping and echoey, but at the same time, it does have this feeling where it's coherent and it all fits together in a very beautiful and established way. The way you built the piece of music fits together really nicely.
Thank you. I really enjoyed kind of seeing how I could keep the integrity by having that motive all the way through. But as you say, kind of have these different textures and all those kind of overlapping sounds. And then right at the end where it's kind of really overlapping, like all the voices are overlapping. It was really fun to write and really fun to work with the choir. So that was Selwyn College Choir with Sarah MacDonald, who is this fantastic Canadian conductor who I'm afraid we stole and has stayed in the UK.
So what's next for you?
What is on my mind at the moment is a community opera that I'm writing, or a community oratorio is probably a better description, that was commissioned by a festival called Jam on the Marsh, which is a festival down in East Kent in the UK. And this piece it's been written with a libretto by Timothy Knapman, and it's a kind of climate crisis fable. And it's for the London Mozart Players, who are a fantastic chamber orchestra in the UK, along with amateur players, so leisure time musicians as well. So there are side-by-side parts for kind of pros and amateurs to play together. There's the local cathedral, so that's Canterbury Cathedral Girls Choir, and along with them, there's also a kind of primary school, so local kind of 6-7-year-old kids choir as well. And it's been a really interesting piece to write. It's been really interesting to marshal all those forces and to really try and give everyone meaningful stuff to do. And I think that's the thing, because I think a lot of those pieces you often see, I don't know if you found this as well, but you kind of had a bedrock of the kind of the professionals' music, and then occasionally the kind of amateurs pop up and do something on top of that. But to try and make it fully integrated and give everyone meaningful things to do has been a really interesting challenge. And it's not one I necessarily think I've got 100% right, but I have tried my best.
And when is this going to be premiered?
July 2023.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so the other thing is that I have is this CD, of which all of those pieces actually we just heard. So the album is called Faces in the Mist, and it's Ely Cathedral Girls Choir and Selwyn College Cambridge Choir, conducted by Sarah MacDonald. And I should say the fantastic trumpeter we heard before was Mitchell Sedgwick, and the organist was Aaron Shilson.
Fantastic.
Who played on those recordings we heard.
And I will include a link in the program notes for that. Where can people find you?
I am on Twitter, which is probably where I'm most active social media-wise, at Composer Peat. And I also have a website, which is www.richardpeat.com.
And I'll point out that Peat is P-E-A-T, not P-E-T-E. So Composer Peat is Composer P-E-A-T. And I am your host for the Melodology podcast. My name is Arthur Breur. Breur is spelled B-R-E-U-R. It's just 5 letters, and the last 3 look like Europe. I'm Arthur Breur on the various different social medias. And this is the Melodology podcast, which is melodologypodcast.com, and just Melody Podcast on the social media and on Patreon. Thank you, Richard, for joining us today. It was great talking to you, and it was just fascinating everything we could learn about what seems to be such a simple melody.
Thank you, Arthur. It's been such a pleasure.
Absolutely. And we look forward to having you come back and listen to the next podcast.